while South Africa waits for the decision by the International Court of Justice on its genocide case against Israel, whatever the outcome, some say this case will definitely make history. But what happens if South Africa claims victory or it doesn't? Let's look at the future implications now and speak to Professor Stephen Chan from the School of Oriental and African Studies Faculty of Law and Social Sciences, who's joining us live now. Let me thank you so much for your time, Professor. How do you think, firstly, as a lot of people are talking about, South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice, do you think we had a strong case, particularly where intent is concerned?
It was a very strong case. It was very, very well prepared. It was also very, very well presented. Having said that, the Israeli defense was also very well prepared and well presented. So it's a real contest. Having said that, I think that the the argument within the South African case was compelling. So I think there is a good chance, not an absolute chance, but a good chance that the International Court of Justice will find in favor of the South African case.
And what becomes the implication should the court find that?
It's a provisional finding at this stage. The full case will go on for quite some time, in previous such cases for years at a time. But there could be a provisional ruling that Israel has to either stop its activities or take far greater care, particularly of civilian casualties in its activities. Whichever way that goes, Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, has already signaled that he will disobey the International Court of Justice. So it'll be up to the international community, the Americans, for instance, others who would regard themselves as close to Israel, to try to persuade him to at least abide by some of the aspects of the findings of the court. It won't be a one-sentence finding. This judgment is likely to go on for several pages in itself. It may even be possible that the Israelis will pick and choose which parts of the judgment to try to abide by.
Professor Chan, I'm not sure if you're still able to hear us, but let's stay then with the allies, because that's also another important part of this, and we're going to get to enforceability and what happens in that regard. But looking at the allies and the fact that they've also been, some of them, you think about the US, been assisting Israel in what has been happening as well. Should they fail then in trying to possibly persuade, Israel, should the court, of course, rule in South Africa's favor, what then becomes an obligation, if at all, in when you think about their involvement?
Again, it depends on the findings of the court. If the court makes a special point of saying that Israel should not be assisted in its activities, then this is an obligation on those like the United States that supply a very great deal of arms and money to Israel. Now, having said that, even if the Americans stopped sending arms right away to Israel, Israel has enough stockpile to last for quite some time, probably, I think, at least another 2 years of this level of activity. So the violence and the killing would not necessarily stop. And in fact, it may be that if the court so rules that Israel should not be assisted, then the Americans might comply, knowing that it would have no real effect whatsoever on Israeli policy and no real effect in the longer term on relations between the Americans and the Israelis.
So looking at, what you just said about Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and how, his posture has been while this case has been ongoing and while a ruling is to be awaited, what then happens and how much of a risk do you think it will put him under from the international community as far as the ceasefire is concerned?
There'll be a very great deal of pressure from the international community. The Americans won't be happy. There's a realization now this is turning into very, very bad public relations for them. The Arab countries are trying to hold out olive branches to Israel. All of this could be endangered if the killing continues. And what Netanyahu is trying to avoid is making any kind of concession to the eventual suggestion that he should be bold and accept the two-state solution. Continuing the violence for him is a way of avoiding that particular decision. But it does mean that the allies of Israel are going to be put in a very, very difficult position. And it's hard to see how that circle can be squared and how everyone can find a way to go forward. What it might do is give the Qataris some window of opportunity to negotiate longer ceasefires. They're necessarily going to be temporary ceasefires if Israel is obdurate, but there are those small windows of opportunity to at least allow a number of people to be released, to be able to escape, to cross the Rafah border into Egypt. There's a very great deal of diplomatic activity on that part, and the international community might try to facilitate some of that diplomatic redress of the worst aspects of the conflict.
How difficult could those talks be, particularly when the Qataris are getting involved? We've seen, of course, the processes unfold, and we've seen some temporary ceasefires and all of that. But we did get a sense, even from some reports, of how difficult these conversations were behind closed doors. Now, given the heightened nature of this matter reaching the International Court of Justice, how difficult are they likely to be?
They're going to be difficult, but it does give the Qataris a window. They're extraordinarily able as negotiators. And unusually for a Middle Eastern country, a significant number of their negotiators are female with very, very high skills. I've met some of them, and I rate them very, very highly indeed. If anyone can try to get some mileage of mercy out of all of this, it'll be the Qataris. So they will be looking very, very closely at the International Court of Justice's verdict, the details of the ruling, and try to exploit any kind of avenue forward that they can find.
Prof, as a final question then, there have been some people that were watching this process in the International Court of Justice and listening to what you had to say then about Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as well. Let's look at the issue of enforceability, because some people are looking at this process as just, window dressing, a waste of time. It doesn't really hold much weight. But others are saying, in fact, it is quite an important process and it is an important step looking at what has been happening on the ground in Gaza. I wonder which side of the argument are you leaning towards?
I think it's a very important and valuable process. It certainly will set a precedent, one way or the other, for future conflicts. So it shouldn't be looked at in isolation. The immediate thing it's done has been to require of the Israelis to put their cards on the table. They've had to justify themselves. They went to great lengths to try to do that. At the same time, what they've done is to have left a hostage to fortune. If they don't live up to their own arguments, then basically that will be a finding against them. So putting their cards on the table will be a valuable step forward. Putting some transparency into what they're trying to do, even if it's atrocious, that will be valuable in itself.
Quite interesting development in geopolitics as well as legal matters there. Prof, appreciate your insights. Thank you so much for your time this evening. That was Professor Stephen Chan from the School of Oriental and African Studies Faculty of Law and Social Sciences.